Hello everyone, bonjour à tous. George, Ariel, Sarah and I are very pleased to welcome you for another seminar as part of the seminar series on programming for mathematics education. We wish to begin this event, as we've done as well with the other seminar presentation, by acknowledging this land where the Field Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences is situated, from where we are hosting this event. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be hosting our online seminar series from the land, from this land. We've already done 2 seminars so far as part of the seminar series. So in the launching seminar, Celia Hose and Richard Nuss discussed the design and implementation of the impressive Scratch Math program for grade 5 and 6 learning of coding with explicit links to the mathematics curriculum. In the second seminar, in the second seminar, Krista Francis and Brent Davis discussed in detail one robotics task for grade 6 students, as they showed us a video involving the teacher and 2 students engaged in the task, and they commented and analyzed this, this engagement in the video, and they discussed how this task may be used to develop conceptions of number. Today, in this third seminar out of 6, we will be hearing about different aspects of computational thinking and programming. And in this case today, we'll be involving data practices in a research involving middle school. So now it will be more centered about grade 6 to 8. And as you know, we will be moving along with 3 other seminars following this one. This series is supported in part by funding from the Mathematics Knowledge Network hosted by the Fields Institute and the Social Sciences of and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And as for the other seminars, we'll have a short introduction of today's speakers, and then we'll hear about for 45 minutes presentation, and that will be followed by a question session moderated by my colleague George. And then we will end with the announcement of the 4th seminar. I think that's it for today, and we are now ready to start today's seminar. Sarah, if you could please introduce today's speaker.
So hello everyone. It's my privilege today to introduce to you our speakers, Dr. Michelle Wilkerson and Edward Rivero. Michelle Wilkerson is an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley in the United States. Her research interests include students' usage of computational representations like computer simulations and data visualizations, and how to support their learning through teachers' professional development and the design of software and curriculum. She's held roles as the leader of the Computational Representations and Education Research Group and the chair and co-chair of AERA's Special Interest Group in Advanced Technologies for Learning. In addition, she was awarded the National Science Foundation's Early Career Grant in 2014 and AERA Division C's Jan Hawkins Award for Early Career Contributions to Humanistic Research and Scholarship and in Learning Technologies earlier this year. Edward Rivero is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education in the Learning Sciences and Human Development. His research focuses on the intersections of learning, power, and technological design. His current dissertation work examines the narratives and ideologies that emerge in the design processes of children from non-dominant communities in tinkering programs. Through participatory design-based research, Edward also works with educators and team facilitators to design activities that leverage the cultural making practices of children to reimagine what counts as technology, design, and making and tinkering spaces. So with that, I warmly welcome Michelle Wilkerson and Edward Rivero for their presentation, Computing with Data as a Window on the World.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I am going to hopefully successfully share my screen. Did that work? Okay. So thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to give this really great lineup. And we're excited to talk about some of our most recent work. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Michelle Wilkerson, an assistant professor at UC Berkeley, and I've been really fascinated by how computers have both fundamentally changed math and science practice, not just in schools, but in the professional world, and how they've provided students with new ways to author and shape the world themselves.
And my name is Ed Rivero, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Learning Sciences and Human Development. And I'm very interested in how young people leverage technologies to reimagine math and science, as well as their own social historical lives.
So we know that this is a strange time for many of us, and some people, maybe even most people, may be home watching this with families and housemates around. So we're going to try and take advantage of that in this presentation, and we've built in some components that are interactive and allow you to discuss with other people who might be in your house. I also wanted to do a quick survey of how many people are on a computer or a tablet with a larger screen. And that's just so we have a sense of how many people might be able to do some other interactive components. And I'll stop sharing just so I can take a look. So those of you who are attendees, if you can raise your hand if you're on a device with a relatively big screen, so a laptop, desktop, or tablet computer. Okay, great. So it looks like we've got about half. And so we'll move forward with the interactive components, and I'll also project those so those of you who are on phones or other devices can still see what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Great. Next. Aha. So some of you may have noticed that the title of this talk is a play on Richard and Celia, who are here. Hi. Their wonderful 1996 book, Windows on Mathematical Meanings, which was foundational in exploring the intersection of mathematics and computing. And the title is, of course, intentional, as this book has had a considerable impact on my own thinking and development as a scholar, and I imagine many others in this seminar. One of the things that stood out to me when I first read Windows as a graduate student, which was not too long ago, but relatively long ago, is how elegantly it wove together questions of mathematics, computing, culture, and epistemology. The book built on the empowering perspectives introduced by the constructionist movement at MIT, but added theoretical development around how computing can help not only foster mathematical development, but reshape what mathematical cultures look like. Noss and Hoyles were prescient in their acknowledgement that mathematics had become foundational as a language of power that governed the smartphones and laptops that we're all on right now. And they noted that the realm of social and cultural life, as much as the quality of life of the individual, is impoverished by the absence of mathematical windows to understand and interpret the world and to change it. And computers, they argued, offered a window, or indeed many windows, into that mathematical world and the ways that students make sense of it. Nowadays, computing with data has become one window that we as mathematics educators hope provides some of that insight into the world. We see this in calls for data literacy and in the increasing prominence of data as a part of the computing and mathematics curriculum. But we want to push back on the idea that a learner or researcher might be on one side of a window, disconnected from and looking through at the mathematics of the world on the other. And that's not what Noss and Hoyles were arguing, but it's an image that this idea might evoke. First of all, we're part of the world, and inextricably a part of the systems of the world, the environmental, economic, and ideological systems. So when we look through a computational window, we see not only the world, but ourselves indirectly or directly reflected back at us. And second, windows are not perfectly transparent. They can and do distort. And it is becoming increasingly more apparent that computing with data has created harmful, even fatal distortions of the world. So here in the United States, this includes distortions that pathologize and criminalize Black people, minimize the danger and humanity of a deadly pandemic, and misrepresent many people's daily lives. And so these differences have led us to focus not just on data literacy and the computational skills it entails, but socio-critical data literacy. So Eddie's going to give us a little more background on what we mean by that, and then we'll talk about how we're bringing computing into the mix.
Sure. So a social critical data literacy draws on Dr. Chris Gutierrez's work through the Migrant Student Leadership Initiative at UCLA, or MSLI, in which migrant students in that program develop social critical literacies that reorganize school-based and everyday literacies into powerful literacies oriented towards social transformation and critical social thought. In Dr. Gutierrez's work, social critical literacies are historicizing literacies that privilege and are contingent upon students' social historical lives. In other words, these literacies are consequential to students' academic development and transform students' activity in their everyday environments. A distinguishing feature of a social critical literacy is its attention to contradictions in and between texts, institutions, like classrooms, the academy, and social cultural practices locally experienced and historically influenced. We draw on this notion of a social critical literacy to develop this concept of a social critical data literacies, a theoretical concept that we're developing to foreground the importance of historicizing data with and for young people as they develop new forms of activity and relationships with data that challenge and transform how they see and act on the world. In order to develop the notion of a social critical data literacy, we draw on a genealogy of scholars that have written about critical data literacies. These scholars have shown how young people, nearly half of whom report being online almost constantly, navigate a datafied culture in which they create traces from the moment they are born. Moreover, Philip and colleagues understand as premised on a set of assumptions which are rooted in particular worldviews and which may obscure certain perspectives and histories and highlight others. In line with these authors, we're interested in developing a curriculum and designing a data science learning ecology where young people can learn about hidden narratives, strategies, and ideologies embedded in data representations. We also saw the importance of positioning young people as architects of data that could read data and reauthor it to develop narratives that challenge deficit notions about their social, historical, and cultural lives. And so we've been working to develop the social critical data literacies with middle school students through the development of a computer-based multi-unit science curricula through a project called Writing Data Stories. This project is a collaboration between UC Berkeley with Dr. Chris Gutierrez, the Concord Consortium with Bill Finsner, and North Carolina State University with Holly Lynn Lee, funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. It includes the development of new pedagogical frameworks, curricula, and software all focused on developing social critical data literacies. Our goal is to support students in not only using computing to analyze data about the world, but transforming those data to reveal new perspectives and telling convincing stories with those data that make clear their social histories and call peers and others to action. In the remainder of the talk, we'll describe in more detail a few of those theoretical ideas that underpin data stories and highlight what we argue is a critical role of computing in social critical data literacy. We'll demonstrate one curricular activity to give you a better sense of the student experience, and then share some of emergent findings from our first year work in classrooms. As we will describe in further detail later, our theoretical framework is guided by a syncretic approach to design of learning ecologies, wherein everyday and academic literacies are reorganized towards the development of more expansive forms of learning. In other words, everyday genres such as argumentation and students' everyday engagements with data held equal weight to academic and scientific content normally taught in school-based settings. So at this point, like Michelle mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, we wanted to transition to do a quick activity that we did with the students in the 7th grade classroom where we conducted our research study. If we could please have everyone find someone in your family to do this activity with you, that would be ideal. If not, you could do this on your own, but we encourage participation so that we can get a fuller experience. I'll wait a little bit to see if folks are interested in having a family member join at this time. So as folks are gathering back up, if you were interested in doing that activity with somebody around, for this activity, please take a few seconds to look at this ambiguous image on the slide and write down what you see. Take about 15 to 30 seconds. Oh yes, that's a good idea. If you want to write it on the chat feature. Could we go to the next slide, Michelle? Okay, so now that you've written down what you see, we wanted to show you different representations of the ambiguous image. Do you see anything different between the two images? Write down if you see the same thing in the two images, or if the one on the left looks different from the image on the right now. So now that we've looked at both images, we wanted to highlight different features between the images. As you can see, when we highlight the features, it becomes much easier to distinguish that the image on the left is a picture of a seal, while the picture on the right is a picture of a horse or a donkey, or maybe some of y'all saw a different picture, which we'll check in the chat later. The arrows and the labels in this case serve as a second stimuli that orient your vision to see something differently, despite us looking at the same image the entire time. In other words, the second stimuli function as data moves that highlight different perspectives on the same evidence. Note that this isn't anything goes. People highlight specific shared features of the data to make sense of it. In the activity that we did with the 7th grade middle school students that we worked with, we found that the students would draw connections between the lines to make the animals that they saw on the page more visible to their audience. Moreover, another strategy that we saw students doing was that they would rotate the page that the ambiguous image was drawn on to orient the audience to see what they were seeing. As such, in this particular 7th grade science unit, we focus on the tensions between objectivity and perspective taking in science. Specifically, we drew on ambiguous images to design experiences for students where they could engage in activities that allowed them to explore different perspectives around data visualization. In this case, students were asked to identify what they believed the image on the bottom was, on the bottom of the slide. Many of the students answered horse, seal, or donkey, showing how even though we were looking at the same data, we nonetheless came up with different interpretations around the image. We argue that this activity was key to the development of social critical data literacies among students, as it allowed them to see how data is a constellation of stories depending on how they are interpreted by the audience. What's more, after students engaged in everyday argumentation about what the correct animal in the image was, they developed strategies and data moves that allowed them to re-represent the data to make claims to truth based on the evidence they saw. These claims to truth in data became an important objective for students to identify as they were later asked to think about what kinds of claims to truth advertisements that they engaged were making. As such, this dichotomy between objectivity and perspective taking with data reminds us that despite its seemingly objective nature, data is ideological and fuels particular worldviews. Through this theoretical framework and the activities we designed, we aim to have students see the ideological and narrative aspects of data so that they could make more informed decisions around claims to truth that they encountered in the everyday.
I was muted. Okay. So Eddie mentioned this term data moves a few times. And the theory that's driving our work at the intersection of computing, mathematics, and these ideas of data and society is this idea of data moves. Data moves simply are actions that alter a data set's contents, structure, or values while maintaining the integrity of the data set. So just like that picture of a donkey or a seal, if you think of a data set out there in the world, there can be many different patterns that might have to be seen or teased out in different ways, depending on your perspective. So those actions that we took with the picture, like highlighting specific parts of the animal, rotating the picture, thinking about the surrounding context, those are the kinds of things we can do using computing to data when we create visualizations or group and analyze data in particular ways. Normally, this kind of data preparation is ignored in the process of analysis, with some exceptions. So Wild and Fancuch call this kind of work transnumeration. However, we argue it's this process of reviewing and rethinking the details of a data set's structure where issues of justice and ideology emerge. For instance, when you start looking specifically at how attributes of a data set are categorized, such as by gender or racial categorizations, you may see very different patterns, or you may wonder about what patterns are suppressed or misrepresented by different approaches to data construction and organization. One really clear and recent example of this is in the US data for COVID infections, which are not appearing. There we go. So at first, here in the States, many states did not report data about race, and some still aren't. But researchers aware of the racial disparities in the US knew that the risk of exposure and complication were higher among communities of color. So using what we would call a data move, grouping, this racial perspective provides a new lens on the data that reveals Americans who are Black or African American are 2 times more likely to die. And that, of course, allows people to reroute resources in a just way. In computational science, many such data moves have been standardized across a variety of data analysis environments and programming languages. They've been referred to collectively as a computational grammar for data. Turning to education, we consider data moves and the tools that support them as a valuable epistemic form or representational infrastructure for data that has thus far been understudied, especially at the K through 12 level. So when we think about things like Scratch, GeoGebra, and NetLogo, these tools introduce students to object-oriented programming, geometric construction, and agent-based modeling, respectively, as computational grammars. These grammars allow students to explore scientific and mathematical ideas in ways that are near impossible without computing. Data moves and the tools that support them similarly allow students to explore and manipulate data, to see it and use it in new ways. In our work, we've been using a tool from the Concord Consortium called CODAP, or the Common Online Data Analysis Platform. But like with other representational infrastructures, there are a number of tools that exist, including RStudio, Tuba, Tinkerplots, and others. In our project, we've been focusing on 4 specific computational data moves. Grouping, like the example showed, organizes data sets into groups or categorizations, which can then be analyzed independently or compared to one another. Filtering allows irrelevant records to be removed from a data set so that analysis can be more focused. Adding new records or attributes allows new perspectives and populations to be included in a data set. And calculating allows existing information to be combined or explored in new ways. So to show how thinking of these kinds of data moves can offer learners new inroads into data that address many of the issues that Eddie raised, we'd like to do another interactive activity, which is a small piece of one of our curricular activities. And so first, I want us to just think about our daily breakfast. You might want to think about who's with you, what's going on during breakfast, what do you eat, how do you decide what to eat, how did breakfast habits become this way? This comes from our unit that's focused on food and nutrition. And these are questions that we ask students. So take a couple of seconds to reflect on that. Okay, and now those of you who are on a big screen, please visit this site. So the link is bit.ly/capital W, capital D, capital S, lowercase cereal. And so what we're doing here is what a lot of school curricula do. And this is in fact how we often think and talk about data. We say that data can really help us with decision-making and understanding patterns. So we're gonna visit this link and start to look at patterns in this data set for a while. If you have questions or specific things you'd like to do, please send a question in the chat and we can show you how. And if you're unfamiliar, if you're already familiar with CodeApp, go ahead and tinker. If not, I'm going to do a quick demo so that you sort of know the kinds of explorations that are possible. So here is what you should see when you visit that link. And why don't I go ahead and put it in our chat so everyone has access. Okay. So you'll see something that looks a little bit like a nutrition facts label. It's called a case card. This is also similar to case cards and tinker plots for those of you who know that. And you can go ahead and flip through to see different records in our data set. You can also click on this icon, which looks like a table, and ask to switch to what's called the case table view. And so here's our full data set. Let's go to the bottom here. To create a graph, so you can start to explore this data set, click on the graph button here in the menu, and just drag any of the variables, what they call attributes you see at the top of this table, onto the graph. And it will plot them. So now I have a plot of the distribution of sugars in our data set. And you can create bivariate graphs by dragging a second one here, or you can create a second graph, visualize something else such as fiber. And when you highlight specific foods, they highlight across all of your representations. So that's, oh, and one last thing. If you want to know more about your graph, you can click this ruler and it gives you additional measures. So for instance, I can have mean plotted. So go ahead and take a few minutes just to explore what kinds of patterns you find in this serial, and then we'll come back together and ask some questions about this data set. Yes, so I got a question about repeating how to organize the graphs. So there are two ways to build a graph. To pull a graph window up, you want to click this button that says graph in the upper left-hand corner. You can create as many as you'd like. And then you can either click and drag any of these variables. And when it turns onto any region of the graph, and if that region responds, then you can let go and it will reorganize the graph. Another thing you can do is just click on an axis and select what you would like plotted against that axis. I hope that's helpful. And as you explore, if you could go ahead and send us via chat, what are some things you notice and what are things you wonder? These are, I expect, very familiar questions to people in this audience.
Right, we're going to do it a bit in WDS. I can't do it. Why don't you do it on your machine? It's really difficult when you're trying to maneuver between one screen and another. I should get myself in a model. So it's bit.ly/WDS0. bit.ly /capital D capital W capital W capital D.
Okay, and I'm going to give everyone about a minute or two. I'm starting to see some notes in the chat here about things people notice or wonder. Okay, and I'm noticing it looks like many people, or the couple of people that left some observations in chat, started to explore whether particular companies offer more or less healthy cereals. It looks like General Mills and Kellogg's especially have sugarier cereals. One thing that we often see students noticing and wondering, especially given that we sort of ground this in their everyday breakfast practices and having them think about what it is they do for breakfast, are that they identify emergent tensions between this data set, which just has cereal as a breakfast option, and their everyday lives where they might not eat cereal, or they might base their decisions on something that's not available in this data set. So for example, students might wonder things like, how do my breakfast foods compare to the foods that are available in this data set? Maybe they're not in the data set. Are there certain nutrition profiles for foods that I think taste better versus what's in this data set? And so these kinds of questions naturally lead them to engage in a number of these data moves. They might need to add records for new foods to the data set, the foods that they want to explore and understand. They might need to add new variables if they think particular things taste good and they want to explore those specifically. They might want to compare nutrition profiles against or across those taste groups to see if there are profiles, much like you did with the companies, but with their own preferences. They might wonder, the serving sizes of these different cereals are so different. I don't know if you noticed, one was 1/4 cup, another one was 1.5 cups. So they might say, I would never just eat 1/4 cup. How can I be sure I'm making a fair comparison across these cereals? This would require a new calculation that standardizes the variables the student is interested in to an equivalent serving size. Other issues that they raise are social. So they might recognize that for a lot of people, healthy isn't a choice when price matters and healthy food options aren't always available. By ignoring that, you might ignore many folks' realities, maybe even peers' realities or students' own realities. So this may lead students to do research and add new variables to the data set that identify how much cereals cost, whether they're accessible in lower income communities. They might then look only at the foods that are reliably available to low income communities to better understand the real options that are available in those communities. So in classrooms, we engage students in many dimensions of this sort of cereal as breakfast exploration. They collect data on their own breakfast habits. They visit the grocery store and make observations about the cereal aisle and how it's organized. They analyze commercials, including the claims about health embedded in those commercials, and compare these against the nutrition facts on the cereal box. And finally, they explore this data set, the cereal data set, equipped with this information and these tensions, which really encourage them to employ these data moves, these computational actions, to make the data set their own. But for this kind of thing to happen, it's difficult. Students are expected to leverage aspects of their lives that usually aren't welcomed in the science classroom. And they're expected to critique this data set, which is seemingly authoritative or is often treated that way in traditional schooling. So this demands a new approach to organizing school activity. And so Eddie's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So in this slide, we show how syncretic approaches to the design of learning ecologies are organized to connect and reorganize practices as to engender new forms of knowledge and expertise that embody characteristics of the best academic and everyday literacies, albeit in new forms. For example, this involves taking an oral written literacy practice that is familiar and valued in students' cultural communities and combining it with an academic genre that mirrors some of the key conventions of the familiar genre, a move to grounding the everyday text in new understandings and forms. In this case, we drew on advertisements and breakfast nutrition data that students engage in everyday as the object of inquiry within the science classroom. By privileging the everyday data of young people, we were able to design a curriculum that allowed them to see how there were hidden ideologies behind the claims to truth that advertisements made. So here are some of the research questions that we had coming into this unit. Just to read them out loud. What are everyday forms of data that young people engage? What strategies did students and teachers develop to decode ideologies and everyday data stories? And what are the micro dimensions of developing a social critical data literacy or social critical data literacies? This is the ongoing study context. We're working with a number of 6th grade classrooms, ages 11 to 12. We're co-designing with teachers. It was an iterative process. We had constant communication with them, and we collected video of classroom, focal groups, screen activity, planning, conversations with teachers, and written artifacts. So for the first part of our findings, we wanted to make the curriculum an object of inquiry to highlight some of the key concepts that we wanted to engage the 7th grade students we worked with. The first key concept that we wanted students to engage was that all claims or stories in data and ads are biased and can't fully represent a phenomenon. We also wanted students to see how implicit or explicit claims in ads or in the selection of data, for example, nutrition labels, don't necessarily include their experiences or priorities, and that they could re-author data in ways that were more consequential to them. As the design of the unit progressed, we also wanted students to be exposed to the types of narratives that were hidden in the everyday data sets that they engaged, such as their breakfast foods or other advertisements. We see decoding the ideological nature of data sets as a key part of developing a social critical data literacy, as it allows students to be able to see the data and their world anew. In other words, rather than being interpolated by ideologies and data sets, our social design experiment aimed to mediate social critical data literacies that allowed students to challenge these ideologies and thus leverage what they saw in data to transform their everyday activity and social historical lives. Specifically, we're interested in seeing how young people could learn to decode ideologies and data and also develop data moves that allow them to author and re-author their own data sets. We also wanted them to develop new relationships with data in ways that would allow them to critically reflect on what they consumed for breakfast and how they interacted with advertisements. So in this first example, we see how the students brought in understandings of advertisements and Yelp ratings to the classroom that influence their activity in the everyday. The children provide 2 examples about how data affects what they buy and where they buy things. One of the students mentions the Yelp app, which shows an awareness on behalf of the student about how information and data is gathered to rank restaurants in their local neighborhood. We'll now watch this first video.
And he's always telling me what he sees, and he believes everything he sees on TV and YouTube. I don't know why. Are you like that? No. No? All right, so that's how he is. But me, I go for like recommendation of my friends. So I go for my friends, like, for example, when I want to eat something, so you know Yelp. So I look at the Yelp recommendations, like, oh, this is what people say. So usually I go more than the ads I've heard on TV or television. I'm more on like personal recommendations or reviews. Yes, Haley.
So like I have a connection because we went to Syncretic, her and I all going to go to the beach. And my mom was taking us, basically she was taking us to a restaurant. My mom was like, oh, so I want to Yelp and this had a 4-star, so we're going. And I'm like, okay. And the food was good, so I guess
So I know that may have been a little bit difficult to hear, but in the video, the student is talking about how Yelp, or she based her family and herself based their decision on what restaurant to go to on the ratings that were on Yelp and the data that she was looking at there. And so this video highlights how our curriculum mediated the development of a learning ecology that privileged students' everyday sense-making around data. Here, we see the students' sense-making around data that they encountered in the everyday and how it was privileged in the classroom. This approach is key to the development of social critical data literacies, as it gives students opportunities to decode ideologies in the data they encounter. Moreover, students could discuss with peers the kinds of data that they interact with in their lives and how they can transform the relationships vis-a-vis these data. In these next 2 short clips, we want to show how students talked about leveraging data moves to make claims to truth. Here we want to focus on how data moves allow students to see data differently and thus interpret it differently. Specifically, Dr. Wilkerson asked students about the kinds of strategies or data moves that they leveraged to convince others that their point of view was right. And here they were drawing on that ambiguous image activity that we did at the beginning of this presentation.
What were strategies? So you talked about this yesterday, you've got them here. Do you remember the different strategies used to convince? What's something someone did to convince you? If you changed your mind yesterday, how did you change your mind, or how did someone else help you change your mind? Does anyone want to admit that they changed their mind? Yeah. What did you do? They told you it was a seal and you said yeah. Did they do anything to help you see the seal, or was it automatic? So they moved the page so that it was easier for you to see. Okay, so that's one strategy, is moving the page. See, hand over here now. In your mind, it was a kangaroo. And what helped you change your mind? Oh, so more people thought it was a seal, so you said, oh, it must be a seal. They call that, when they're doing advertising, they call that bandwagon. Like, you want to do it because everyone else is doing it, or it must be true because everyone says so.
So another key aspect that emerged through the conversation in the video is the concept of bandwagoning used in advertisements. Here we see how students were influenced by their peers to accept a claim to truth. This conversation set precedent for other strategies that they had encountered in the everyday that convinced students to buy, do, or believe something based on the data they engaged with. In the following video, we see how one student was already aware of one strategy known as clickbait that advertisers use to get individuals to click on their products.
clickbait and say that like it's gonna do a bunch of stuff, but people when they really get it and then returning. Yeah.
Jaden, that's a great question. Can somebody raise your hand and tell Jaden he could do that? And people have tried doing that. So what can go wrong if you do that? Anybody?
So as we just saw, just observed, the student in the class is aware of clickbait, a form of false advertisement that uses hyperlinked text or a thumbnail link that is designed to attract attention and to entice others to follow that link and read, view, or listen to the linked piece of online content, with a defining characteristic of being deceptive, typically sensationalized or misleading. We argue that understanding these strategies in advertisements is key to developing social critical literacies, as it allows students to decode and critically reflect on how data is being represented in their everyday and digital lives. And we have one more clip for y'all. Finally, this video shows how students were tasked to look at advertisement and think about the target audience. And you can play the video now, Michelle.
Kids yesterday, but it's all empty kids, okay? So you guys put kids in the blank. Who was thinking of like adults, any kind of adults, parents, grandparents yesterday? Okay, you can put that in your first grade, that's fine. That's what you were thinking. And if you were thinking stores already, yes, it's stores. Whatever was in your head, write it down. Was there anything I didn't cover? Such as my pet, that would be silly. Right?
And that was just the teacher speaking there, but in this particular activity, we wanted to convey that data representations tell stories to various audiences and that multiple audiences interpret data differently. This video gets us to think about what audiences we target when we tell data stories, how are data stories being interpreted, and how do we target, who do we target when we write data stories? And so along those lines, after learning about these various strategies and data moves that advertisement companies leverage to make claims to truth about products, students then develop their own advertisements to get a better feel of how these strategies work. In the two pictures of students' work here, we see how they're engaging and making their own ads and the types of strategies they employ to sell their toys. I want to specifically draw our attention to the work on the right-hand side, where the student makes a specific claim about how to make his toy more appealing to an audience. Here, the act of selling a toy allowed the student to develop a narrative and gain deeper understandings around the hidden ideologies behind data sets. For example, the student on the right has a 6-star rating for his toy and shows how 1,921,000,000 voted 6 stars for their toy. Similar to the first video where we showed the student talk about Yelp convincing her family to go to a restaurant based on the data reviews, this child leverages a strategy to make a claim that their toy is the best ever amazing Lego bricks. The children also use multimodal representations of data, including drawings, ratings, and customer reviews to see how advertisers sell them products. And to conclude our finding section, or actually we have one more, but by making everyday types of data objects of inquiry in the design of our learning ecology, we were able to gain better understandings of how data affects young people and how they see the world and act on it. Over the course of a few weeks, we saw how young people learned about the ideological nature of data and also brought in everyday knowledge that revealed how they were aware of how data governs their lives. We also gave students opportunities to engage with strategies companies use to convince and to reauthor data sets to make them consequential to their own lives.
And so students did this in a number of ways. If we look back at, so this is students manipulating the very same data set that you all interacted with earlier on in the session. And you'll see that they added their own foods to the data set and introduced one, and often more than one, depending on the group, new dimensions to look at. So here, this is the cereal data set, but you'll notice there's a new column called taste. And of course, every group wanted to add taste as an important dimension for decision-making regarding cereal or any breakfast food. They also added price here. And although they haven't filled it out yet, they also added cooking. So one thing that was important to them is how much effort do we need to put into our breakfasts, and acknowledging that a lot of people eat breakfast that needs to be cooked, which was not previously a part of this data set. It's a fundamental transformation in how they're thinking about the breakfast and what ought to be included. On the right, you'll see that another set of students has used taste to group their data set. And then they used multiple graphs to compare and determine the relative health of foods that they identify as tasting good or bad.
And here we're showing the cycles of iterations of developing social critical literacies and constructing data stories with young people. To reiterate, in order to develop social critical data literacies, it is essential to engage with data that is consequential to young people and that they interact with in their everyday lives. In our case, we saw the data in the advertisements as well as the nutrition facts and breakfast foods as a key entryway to bring in student everyday engagement with data to the classroom. However, mere inclusion of these types of data in the classroom is not enough. We also worked with students to develop strategies that allow them to decode narratives in advertisements as an exercise to get them to see the hidden ideologies that are embedded in data sets. Through conversations around data moves, students were also able to see how multimodal representations of data allow different audiences to see the same data in multiple ways. Finally, our work is oriented toward positioning young people as architects of data that author and re-author data that is consequential to them and their communities. Along these lines, we hope that more research continues to be done around the ideological nature of data and how young people can begin to decode and re-author data in ways that are empowering and potentially emancipatory.
And so we're currently producing other units. We have one focused on climate change, and we're using the grounding of special places. So students think about a special place to them anywhere in the world, why it's special, and then start to explore data related to that place around climate. And one of the focuses is the disproportionate causes versus effects of climate as it's distributed around the globe. And then a third unit on environmental racism that focuses on more local effects of pollution and respiratory health. This is the rest of our team, and we're happy to hear feedback and take questions, and we thank you very much for this time.
Thank you so much, Eddie and Michelle. It was really, really interesting. It kept me thinking the whole time, and I've heard you speak before, but this was a different presentation than the other one. With the other ones, you're building stories with visual elements, which probably you're still doing, but but I'll start talking about that. So this is time now for questions and comments, and we'll open up the session to anyone in our panel that would like to jump in and ask a question of our speakers today.
Okay.
Go ahead, Cecilia.
Oh,
you or me?
You go.
It turns out we both want to say something.
No, here you go.
Okay, so first of all, can I just congratulate the two speakers? It's absolutely wonderful. And unfortunately, it couldn't be a better moment to study the relationship between ideology and data. I hope that goes away, but I doubt that it ever will. My question is about research methodology. You have this huge range of things that you want to study, understanding of ideology, taste, politics, mathematics. My mind boggles, and unless you have a research team of several hundred people, how do you focus on one or two things at a time, and how do you bring all these different perspectives to bear on each other?
Part of my answer to that question is just to put this last slide up again. I don't think it got enough airtime, but we do have a very large team. So this is not the whole team, and this is in partnership with Chris Gutierrez, who really focuses on these ideas of socio-criticality. And so that's not to say that we have all of the answers, but we're very deliberate in involving people who have studied for many years the different dimensions of this project, where I'm of course bringing sort of attention to the computational aspects and really focusing my time and some of my research assistants' times on that. And Chris, along with Eddie and many other students, are focusing on the socio-critical aspects and sort of how do we reorganize the classroom in the first place so that this can happen, which is a question in and of itself, especially when you're involving things like data and computing and things that traditionally have not honestly valued students' personal experiences as much as we hope or like that they should. Methodologically, it's a lot of video. It's a lot of undergraduate help, and I'll have Eddie speak to this too, but we do have a lot of undergraduates just going through all the video and tagging. So they understand a lot of the underlying hypotheses of this work. And we're creating video logs just to say, where are there elements that we can go back to better understand how politics plays out in this class, how understanding the computational aspects, specifically filtering, grouping, right? These actions that we're interested in are playing out, so that then the team can go in with a little more focus and identify where in this sea of data we can sort of start to do some more serious work. Eddie, are there aspects of that you want to add?
I think you hit them all, but there are just so many moving parts, and it's just wonderful having that many people on the team from across various disciplines. But I do appreciate the collaboration that happens across institutions and across generations as well. Like Michelle mentioned, we have undergraduate students that we work with. So there's a lot of, there's time to talk about things like syncretism, social critical literacies, and how do they relate to data literacies. So we have these conversations, we have bi-monthly meetings and check-ins, and then we have Slack channels that we've developed to keep ongoing conversations over time. We have shared readings, so it does take a good degree of iteration and constant communication to be able to work in this interdisciplinary manner, and sometimes even transdisciplinary manner.
Could I just ask a follow-up? In terms of, I'm more interested in the mathematical or computational side. How some of the conjectures they have, because there's a lot going on there. I remember with Tinkerplots, I mean, it takes a little while. It's absolutely wonderful tool, but I just wondered, did you feel they could really use the power of that tool to explore their own hypotheses and really think about the stories behind the data in the way you want to?
We do some scaffolding around that, and so I can talk a little bit about what the scaffolding looks like, which I think will start to speak to your question. Unfortunately, I'll also mention, we started this project this year, and so we intended to go into the classroom 2 or 3 times with different units, and of course that got shut down, so we only have data from the first unit. But the way that we scaffolded there is we started with just unidimensional graphs, and we spent a few days talking about how do we interpret these, right? Because the dot graphs are not intuitive and not sort of normative in the curriculum. So just how do we make sense of this one graph of sugar? But then we started to expand the variables that students could look at using that method. So now choose an attribute that matters to you. Maybe it's taste, which would look very different if you only plot taste right on the x-axis. Or look at fiber because that's important to you. And then we had them create the 2 graphs that were all univariate. So in the first unit, the nutrition unit, they're never even looking at bivariate graphs. They're looking at multiple univariate graphs and the relationships between them. And that they're able to answer quite a few questions with, because they optimize for the 2 or 3 variables they care about. Let's say, I'm trying to think of one specific case that actually happened. So taste, fiber, and sugar. And they do that through highlighting. So let's highlight all the things that taste good and see where they lie on the fiber graph and see where they lie on the sugar graph. So I'd say that we saw evidence that they were able to get there after 3 or 4 days of engagement with CODAP. And our plans going forward are to build on that. So the next unit would assume that that skill has been developed and then build on that to think about filtering or think about bivariate graphs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard and Celia. Is there anyone else on the panel that may have a question or a comment?
I have a question.
Ricardo, please go ahead.
So first of all, thanks a lot for sharing these great ideas. Yeah. I think my question is about what kind of discussions the students have about the serving size, right? And the relation with other items like calories or so on. I think this is an important aspect to analyze on those nutrition informations, right?
I don't know if I can answer that specific question. I know that there were some discussions of serving size, but again, it's a lot of data, so we haven't looked at that specific component systematically. It's interesting because it comes up often among educators. And it's a nice, I think it could be a nice scaffold into some of the more heavily computational elements, such as then standardizing for a serving size. And one idea we had was to have students collect data on their own serving sizes, find out how much cereal they eat, and then standardize to their meal, for instance. So I agree, it's an interesting thing to look into further. We just haven't done that yet.
I also agree that it's very interesting. There is one instance in the data where we see one of the students playing on CODAP with the serving size, and they see the calories and everything is going up, the percentage is going up and down. So it is something that is of interest to them. And in that exploratory phase, that's something that they kind of looked towards, or they were interested in looking at, playing with that serving size. So I think that's a great question. And like Michelle said, it's something that will be important for us to build on.
Thank you, Ricardo. So that issue of serving size, we haven't been to the United States recently, but when we traveled there with our children, we did notice that compared to Canada, serving size, which in the US seemed to be at times twice the size. Like if you buy an ice cream, it would be gigantic. In different places, like if you go to a movie theater, you might get Coke, let's say, or something like a drink, but it's like a barrel, that you're carrying with you. So that would be interesting to, I don't know how you would get data like this, but different places, different venues, and what sizes they. So I think the question that Ricardo asked, I think it's come up in your research is interesting. Thank you so much. Anyone else on the panel? With a comment?
Actually, I just wondered about the sizes of clothes. I remember when we were in the United States, I'm about a size 8 in this country, in England, but when I go to the United States, I think I go down to about a 4 or something. I mean, it's something very interesting and cultural about how we buy things and we think the size and if it's too big. So I just thinking, rather than just food, we look at clothes and fashion and how that's being shaped. But anyway, I want to leave it to someone else to speak, sorry.
If I could just
to buy clothes in the UK, because I'm like a size 12 or 14.
And to speak a little bit to that, I think that gets to, so early on in the talk, Eddie talked about sort of socio-critical literacies being based on these tensions, right? And I think identifying tensions between own experience and data, or data from different countries, it exposes so much about body image. It exposes so much about how we think of ourselves and others. So that's exactly the kind of thing that we think is productive, both for developing this kind of literacy and for really pushing and motivating computational analysis and computational modification of the data set.
May I ask a question before we pass it on to our participants? So computational analysis, so what the tools you're using are not similar, let's say, to Scratch or Python. It is an environment that allows you to analyze. How would you classify it or compare it to, let's say, a traditional computing language versus these environments? Where do they fit in? Is there a spectrum, and in what ways are they or are they not similar?
Yeah, so let me see if I can find the slide really quickly, because this is another thing that I just sort of blipped through quickly. The way I've been thinking about computational languages and how to sort of classify or categorize them is through this lens of epistemic forms and games. So I will find, which also, especially among the constructionist community, has been called representational infrastructures. And so thinking less about what's the form of the language, so block-based versus, text or that kind of thing, but thinking more about what are the computational actions that are at the heart of this tool. Where when I think about Scratch, it's object-oriented programming, right? You have these sprites and you can give them instructions, and you might do that with text, you might do that with blocks. There are a number of ways you can do it. Or thinking about agent-based modeling, we have a number of similar agents that are given rules, and then they all execute those rules in parallel. And so those ideas of what are the actions that allow us to think about systems in new ways. And for data analysis, those actions are the things that we've been calling, here we go. I've been conceptualizing those. There's so many buttons to click. There we go. So here I'm really interested in data moves as these actions that are the focus of tools. And I would argue that Python, if you look at the DPLYR, anyone who's familiar with data analysis tools, so there's a Python language that's specifically for data analysis. It's widely used among computational analysts. And if you look at the way it's structured, it is around these very same data moves. So the programming language was created to make things like filtering data, restructuring data, recalculating data easy, in the same way that I would argue CODAP is. And though the forms look very different, those computational actions are, I wouldn't say invariant, but at least very similar across a whole class of tools. So I would argue it's computational, not necessarily in the text programming way, but in the, we're highlighting a set of actions and making those actions available in different computational ways, whether it's click, drag and drop, using Python programming, whatever that happens to be. I don't know if that wasn't a very well formulated answer, but I think it's really around what kind of thinking and action do we want to facilitate?
Thank you, Michelle. That's really helpful. So I'm going to be looking a little bit more into that because, I mean, I see so much value in what you're doing, obviously, not just the questions you raise with students, but the tools you're using and the ways you're using them and making them real for students. So thank you so much for that. So, okay, so looking at, let me access my participants list, attendees. If you have a question, could you raise your, I see Sandra Becker has her hand up. Sandra, did you want to ask a question? I'm going to unmute you just in case you do. Oh no, you have your hand down now. Anyone have a question, please raise your hand and I will unmute your microphone. I don't see any hands up.
Maybe George, I just would like to read, someone had to leave before, but just left a comment. So Mathieu Thibault from Canada. So yeah, thanks for the nice webinar. And he says, let's continue to engage students to look into questions that are significant for them by working on data moves and offering them to be architects of data. So I don't know if you would like to comment on that, the idea of looking into questions that are significant for them, or to offer them a medium to be architects of data.
Yeah, I think something that we saw in the data is that when they were in the exploratory phase of CODAP, the students were really interested in playing with the map feature. There's this map feature where you can open it up and there's a globe. And so students were immediately attracted to spaces where that they could relate to. So that kind of influenced the next unit that we started developing, where Michelle at the end of our presentation started talking about a special place that they could link to and learn about climate justice issues, the climate justice issues of that place locally and how they connect to climate justice issues globally. So I think all that is to say that it's key for us to learn from students and their interests and their social historical lives, and to connect data that's relevant to them, and to also organize learning in ways that allow them to write their own data stories about things that are consequential to them, both politically and in terms of their own interests as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of hands up. I see France Caron and Tina Marie. So we'll start with France. I will there we go, France. I think you should be able to use your microphone now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I really like this idea of looking into the bias in the data. There certainly is a lot of that. And also, you have this very strong statement where you say that all stories and data and ads are biased and can't fully represent phenomenon. And I think this is rather strong. I would agree with you that there is always simplification. We cannot capture the complexity. But I was wondering whether we shouldn't be cautious also about using bias for those simplifications that may not have been even driven by unconscious bias, but just the necessity of simplifying because we cannot address everything at once. So that's the first part of my question. And the second part would be, I was also amused to see the students, when they were adding new variables, the notion of taste, and it was like a very clear-cut call. It's good, it's not good, if there was one part of the data that could be really biased and people in the room might have different opinion, would be that as well. So I was wondering what kind of reflection was triggered by that specific taste column, if they realized how biased also that new information could be.
Yeah, I have lots of different directions to take this, so I'll try to, and Eddie, of course, jump in as needed. So one thing we didn't focus on as much in this talk is so the title of the project is Writing Data Stories. And the idea is that they're telling their own story through data, but another aspect of that is telling the story of data itself. So for instance, what did we do to these data to get the conclusions that we got? And so I want to highlight that both as speaking to the issue of bias in data and maybe speaking to this taste and the debate around taste. Because yes, students were more than one student in a group, so they might disagree on how something tastes. So the idea is that eventually, and we're working with Concord to develop tools within Kodak where students can sort of record the history of the manipulations they made to the data. And the idea is that then they could talk about, for instance, we created a new category called taste and had to negotiate what tasted good or how many categories we wanted to include and why. And so the idea is not just that data are biased in some way you might not understand, but that the necessary decisions that you make, as you said, to simplify or maybe just to standardize across all people in our group so that we can agree on a taste, that becomes part of the story of the data, sort of becomes encoded with the data so that you can interpret it with reference to the history of the data. And so I know bias is a word that evokes intent, but really I think we're trying to get to, there's always going to be manipulations that simplify or otherwise skew the data. And if we're honest about what we have done to the data, then we can make more informed decisions about how much we want to believe the conclusions or in what ways those conclusions might be valid or invalid. It's hard.
Was that statement of there is always bias in data kind of conveyed to the students? Like, I'm almost afraid that, like, as you said, climate change, or if no data is valuable in the end because there's always bias, there may be a rejection of science altogether once we start going in that direction. And it's a very comfortable position to accept afterwards that, well, I don't believe in this, and the data is not helping me to believe in it because it's biased, as we all know it.
I see Eddie muted himself, so I'm gonna, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a lengthy answer to that, but I do know that in our presentation when we made that comment, it was very, it was related to the advertisement data.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to show how that there was bias in that. I guess I would argue there's always bias in advertisements because they're trying to get you to buy something. So there's going to be a misrepresentation. But I think our talks around objectivity and perspective taking, I think that's something that we really try to focus on, where yes, there's like some objective truth to how data is being represented, but then there's also like ways that we may interpret that data and story. So there's this like tension, productive tension there that we wanted to sit with.
Yeah, and I think it's always a tension when you're talking about data and the social nature of data. But thinking about, I think often with kids, and I'm thinking now of this project, but also projects in the past I've done using data in science classrooms, establishing early on, what would you need to trust that something is happening, so that students have their own standards of evidence and they're comparing the data against those standards of evidence. So it's not just all data is made up, you can't trust any of it, but you need to decide for yourself based on what you know, whether a data set might be trustworthy if it's met particular conditions. And so then I think, that's why I accept a lot of climate change data, because it meets my personal conditions of what makes sense. Whereas I might reject data that come from a less authoritative place, or don't include things that I think are really important to think about when you're looking at climate change. But it's tricky.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Really important questions there. Thank you. So we'll moving on to Tina Marie, and Tina Marie, you should be able to ask your question now or make a comment.
Okay, yes. I'm an educator in Hamilton, Ontario in Canada. Bonjour, everybody. I just wanted to know, I guess, from a teacher's standpoint, I like that you touched on scaffolding, but did you start out with a focus question or a way to assess student success? Because, I mean, across the board, we usually start with a focus question, like, what are you trying to teach the students? What are you trying, and what's the end, what you have to kind of think with the end in mind. So I like the in between, the exploratory. I find that's easy to assess, the as, of, and for learning. But what was, in the end, kind of your basis for success, your assessment piece? Did you look at that, or that was my question?
Yeah, I think I think most precise assessments we do are through exit tickets. So it's actually not a summative assessment at the very end, because that's a project. But after each unit where we're expecting particular skills, so we talked a little bit about reading univariate graphs, they actually get a 5-minute exit ticket at the end of the day that says, where would you put your food here? Where's the food that's sugariest? And so we sort of get it more of those basic components that we're hoping that they understand really frequently over the course of a unit, so that final big project where they're telling their story isn't the only assessment, because we realize that because it goes in whatever direction students are interested in, it can be a little bit harder to do an understanding check on that specific place. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tina Marie. So I think we've come to the end of our questions from what I can tell. Michelle and Eddie, we'll give you a chance if you have any final comments, and then Chantal will speak to us and wrap it up. Michelle and Eddie, would you have any comments or any final thoughts you want to share with us?
It looks like we're okay, but just want to say thank you, everybody, for listening to our presentation.
Okay, so thank you again to our speakers, to Michelle and Eddie. That was very insightful, and as well complementing what we have heard about so far about programming and computational thinking in math education. So thank you very much for having shared your research on this. So thank you as well again to the participants who joined us today. If you could please take a minute and just fill out the brief attendance survey at this URL that you see here. I think Sarah will put it now in the chat so that you can simply click on it. So tiny.cc/OSS-3. Again, that is simply for funding purposes. So if you could please take that 1 minute to fill this out. We have so far, I had put the numbers before, I believe 144 views of the videos of the seminars that we had from the first two. So we know that they're being used. I'm certain that the one from today again will be used. So they are found on the website. You may as well inform some of the colleagues about these so that they can view them at a later time. We want to thank again the Mathematics Knowledge Network hosted at the Fields Institute and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for the funding of this event, for making this event possible. So we will see you, we hope to see you in 2 weeks. We know it's vacation time, so you might be looking at the recording. But for those who are not in vacation, we hope to see you in 2 weeks on July 31st. The talk will be, the seminar will be presented by Kronis Kinigos, who will be talking about designing for mathematics through baking. See, we moved from cereals from today to baking. So on top of having that link with computational thinking and programming, we have as well that link, that smooth transition to the next seminar. So thank you again. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the speaker, and we see you in 2 weeks. Merci beaucoup, au revoir, et on se voit dans 2 semaines.